her archives give us windows into how she saw the world and into the way in which she shared with the world these interconnected relationships. When she was in the forests of Western Tanzania, she started to visualize that each bit is a thread on this beautiful interwoven tapestry of life. And by digitizing and being able to access the archives that we have, these handwritten archives, it allows us to get a window into that beautiful tapestry of life that Jane describes.
Hey everyone, I'm Randi Larson from the Generative AI Innovation Center at AWS. We're capturing the raw, unfiltered conversations that tell you what the what is when it comes to AI. Right now, somewhere in your company, there's someone carrying context that only they possess. Most people assume their ways of thinking are understood, simply because they've lived them. They aren't. And here's the thing, the tools to capture that knowledge have never been more capable. AI can do extraordinary things, but even the most powerful AI is useless without the context to fuel it, that knowledge that each employee carries within them. Today, we're talking about how to unlock it. One scientific research program with 6 decades of irreplaceable data locked in archives decided this was not something they were willing to risk losing. What they've built with AI is something the largest organizations in the world are only beginning to reckon with. This episode is about what becomes possible when you stop treating institutional memory as something to document and start treating it as something to protect. And every leader owes it to themselves right now to ask, how will I cast this legacy forward? And today, I'm joined by Anna Rathman from the Jane Goodall Institute and Taimur Rashid, also from the AWS Generative AI Innovation Center. So excited to have you both.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Anna Rathman, and I have the privilege of being the executive director of the Jane Goodall Institute, where we are carrying Jane's work and her legacy forward in conservation programs throughout Central Africa and around the world through our Roots and Shoots program.
And I'm Taimur Rashid. I lead the Generative AI Innovation Center here at AWS. And our charter is really to help customers get the most value out of AI. And we support organizations of all sizes across many industries. And we get the privilege to work with companies and institutions like the Jane Goodall Institute to really uncover all the decades worth of data that they have using AI.
Exactly. And the decades of data is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Anna, as you know well, JGI owns one of the longest running scientific studies in human history, 65 years of chimpanzee and baboon data in the jungles of Gombe, Tanzania. So we're talking handwritten notes, thousands of hours of video footage, much of it still analog. Mm-hmm. That's a lot. So JGI and AWS partnered then to digitize all of this using AI, making decades of research searchable for the very first time. And for those of you listening, your version of this is data scattered across drives, email threads, and the wisdom inside of the minds of people who will eventually move on. So, Anna, honest moment, when you looked at the archives, all of the archives years ago, what did you fear losing? And I don't mean the data itself, but something deeper.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the important thing to keep in mind about our archives is that it was really important to Jane that we maintain handwritten notes. And that for her was a critical way that she sought to document and observe. She felt there was a strong correlation, and a lot of neuroscience research supports this, that when you actually take a pencil or a pen and you write on something, there's a stronger connection made between the brain and what you're observing. And so Jane felt very strongly that this was how she wanted her research to continue and be recorded. That doesn't mean to the exclusion of using other technologies. Of course, we use tablets. Of course, we use iPhones and other things. But she was very clear that any of our forest monitors and researchers in the field would also do handwritten notes. So what that meant, and as you said, is we now have over 65 beautiful years of handwritten notes and observations about our closest relatives in the animal kingdom, the chimpanzees, and then also baboons. We also have a baboon study. What we were fearful of losing was that longitudinal data of understanding multi-generational relationships We've had the privilege now of watching several generations of chimpanzees and baboons, but chimpanzees specifically I'll speak about here, and to see how behavior is carried on through those generations, to see how that may influence future generations, to see family relationships, social dynamics, changes in the environment. So 65 years of that window, if we weren't able to actually have that data accessible, meant that window gets so much smaller.
And it's fascinating how it really is one of the most meticulously, recorded or meticulously documented records, all by hand, but with intent, right? Yeah. So to commit that to memory and to be able to really absorb the information
100%
that you're taking in. Taimur, I just have to think the executives listening right now are probably thinking, we don't study chimps, but we do, have decades of engineering specs, client histories, leadership decisions. So when a founder retires, really at any enterprise, even at a startup, or a veteran employee leaves, what are executives really losing?
Well, what executives are really losing is that institutional knowledge, right? And so when you look at how IT has evolved, many CIOs and CTOs have procured so much software technology. And this is a mixture of commercial off-the-shelf software, software as a service. And in the process of implementing that software, they've had many people work on those systems, right? And so you've had years of consultants and employees that have worked on these systems. And some of them have left, some of them have moved on. And now you have this institutional knowledge that you've not really captured, right? And that is the biggest fear in organizations is how do you retain that intent? How do you retain that understanding? You might have these systems which over time have gotten very complex. They've, incurred their own kind of technical debt, operational debt. But how do you really comprehend these systems? And that's the biggest challenge right now in front of many executives is how do they look at these systems and modernize them in a way where they can be very intentional about it while not losing that context.
Yeah. And so that intentionality, again, I think is what's key. And it's when you have that context, it's what turns AI, from just a tool to AI as an actual institutional partner. Anna, when you think about Jane's field notes, they really hold the intuition of a scientist who changed how we think about what it means to be human. So when your team first heard about using AI for the preservation of these archives, what did it take to feel comfortable knowing that tech could not just preserve the data, but the soul of the content itself?
I love this question. I love this question because as you referenced earlier, this can feel like a big bridge between us. Mm-hmm. And it's really not because, first of all, again, to reference back to Jane, for her, technology was something that she always embraced. She was 91 years old when she passed away. She was, without a doubt, one of the most curious people I ever had the privilege to know and to work with. So when a new technology, a new tool, a new thing came on to the stage, she wanted to know about it. And, Jane not only observed chimpanzee behavior, but she was one of the first scientists to document tool use in a non-human species. Now, that's significant because at the time, the use of tools was what defined us as humans. Mm-hmm. So think about that. You have now an observation, a young scientist saying, guys, we're going to have to redefine humanity because other animals use tools. Nowadays, that's very accepted. We see it in various crow species. We even see some different squid that use tools. There's intelligence in these other species. But so for Jane, tools and new tools was something that she embraced. So for us at the Jane Goodall Institute, when we started having conversations around the use of AI and how to integrate it into our research, and in not just our research, but our processes of how we collect research, how we discern what we're seeing in the research, it was a natural conversation. And Jane was open to it because it allowed us to use that meticulously created research archive in new ways. Mm-hmm.
And I love that she obviously is such a beacon of hope and optimism. And, you might think, oh, kumbaya, but really it sounds like she was a realist too.
100%.
Didn't shy away from new technology if it was going to be useful. Interestingly, it's not, we might think, oh, it's about nostalgia, but really, I mean, it's turning all that your organization knows into like really this queryable, durable asset.
100%. It's about being able to ask new questions.
Yeah.
And I think that if there was a moment where the tide turned of, let's learn more to, yes, let's do this with implementing AI and using these kinds of models in our work, it was that moment of this allows us and future researchers, future scientists to ask new questions based upon a data set that had been collected over decades. So, what a beautiful thing that we're very future focused in that way.
Exactly. And so you clearly unlocked this constraint. You made the data available across all the various formats. Taimur, similarly, when you're working with institutions, large enterprises, as I mentioned, scrappy startups even, we hear that they have this intent to become an AI-first, AI-led business. But the real constraint really isn't the capability at this point, right? It's that availability of the context. So what implications does this have for organizations when, their most experienced people will inevitably move on?
No, it's a great question. And when you look at it, the tools are very capable. So you look at the AI models, we've progressed so much over a very short period of time with what these models can do. The biggest constraint right now is, even though you have capabilities of what the models can do, is what's the context of the company for how they should carry out those tasks, right? And, going back to Anna, you were talking about just this observational kind of data that you've collected, right? Which is taking a very analog experience and then trying to digitize it. What's very unique about where we are in technology is we already have a lot of those things that are in digital form. But how do we understand sort of the analog representation of why something was written the way it was, right? And in many ways, these AI agents can do work, but what is the substrate that they should do the work on? And this is where the biggest unlock that executives are trying to do is that how can you represent context of those systems? In many ways, software written 10 years ago versus software written today is written in a very different style. So not only is the intent of what was written different, the culture that actually wrote it is also different too. And so there is this effort to how do you decode context, but how do you decode culture as well? And from that is a thing that sometimes is lost as companies grow, as people leave. And that's going to be the big unlock for executives is how do you take these capable AI agents and actually guide them on what to do based on the context of the company?
I love how you draw that connection between the culture and the context together and how that's, it's all evolving. And so to be able to wrap your arms around both is really what makes agents useful is what I'm hearing. And when you think about it too, context really is like that demonstrated execution, right? So you know how the work is getting done, what the roles are, when they're involved, what behaviors lead to success.
Exactly. And then if you actually look at there's so many data formats. Data is fragmented, it's structured, unstructured. Oftentimes, there's data quality issues. And I think even with observing, chimpanzees, there are different kinds of notes that were taken, right? Different 100%. Languages.
Yes.
And so how do you decode all of that? It gets very, very interesting.
Right. The complexity demonstrated at the Institute it sets a high bar, is what I'll say.
Can I speak to that
Please.
Point quickly? Because you're hitting on a very interesting point. It comes back to what we were talking about of being able to ask more questions with the data set. Our notes not only are taken in the local language, Swahili, but it's a dialect of Swahili that's very specific to that region. And then it's shorthand. So you end up with an extraordinary data set that only a small number of people can actually decipher. And that's been one of the most powerful parts of working with AI is unlocking that. The ability of not only can we now understand the short format of a dialect of Swahili, but that can be understood in any language that any researcher is approaching it from. Extraordinary.
Yeah. The shorthand definitely adds complexity. I can imagine.
And even to build on that, if I may, when we do these architectural diagrams, you talked about handwriting them.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what kind of technology we have. Everyone loves the whiteboard, right?
Yeah.
And within those architectural diagrams that people whiteboard, you can use AI to actually understand that, right? Capture that, right? So I thought that was an interesting analogy about the connection, right, between the drawing something, writing it out in analog form,
Yeah.
and then seeing how that can translate into digital form.
Yeah. I want to pivot a little bit because there's something, Anna, that I've been thinking a lot about. We see the names of founders, on buildings. We know about the things that they've built and that body of work over their lives. But what message, should this be sending to other aging pioneers right now, where we think about it's actually their irreplaceable wisdom that is their most valuable asset. And it's at risk sometimes at fading into the distance.
It is.
Yeah.
And that, what a loss.
Yeah.
What a loss. What a loss, not just for a company or an organization or a team, but what a loss for all of us to lose wisdom, whomever is creating that wisdom, what a loss for us. So yes, to document it, to have it accessible for future generations is so, so critical to carry on what was so meaningful. And I loved what you were saying about context and culture, because even that needs to be documented to understand how we got to where we are. And so much of, if I can link it back to Jane, how she found herself in the forests of Western Tanzania, it was to ask the question of how did modern humans develop the behaviors that we now exhibit? And that was looking at behaviors not documented in the fossil record. So, of course, we had found fossils of older human species, but she was sent there to observe the behavior of our closest animal relatives. So her documentation of that was asking that exact question of how did we get to where we are? And for any founder organization, company, anything, it's so important to document why we did this, how we got to where we are. And this is where I'd like to see it go forward.
Right, exactly. I actually have been very curious about that, sort of that carryover between watching, primates and then kind of thinking about the application for humans too. I mean, and even in business, in particular in business, as emotional intelligence becomes more important, is there a real connection that we can learn from there? So
the answer is yes.
Yes.
We're animals, folks, and we are humans.
Let's face it. Yeah.
But there's a lot to learn. There's a lot to learn. And behavioral studies are something that we can all apply to our lives in professional and personal ways.
So you've teed me up perfectly for my next question. So Taimur, with chimpanzees, with baboons, they build relationships and form alliances and navigate conflict, very real human experiences. When organizations unlock, this similar longitudinal data, what have you seen become possible in terms of, pattern recognitions and other kind of real human skills like relationship building that tech can in fact unlock?
Yeah. There are a few things that I think we observe, right? When you start using a technology, it influences culture and it influences how people organize around that technology, right? And so when you look at the promise of AI is that it can increase productivity. And we have many examples of that so far where software developers, knowledge workers are getting 20 to 40% productivity gains in the work that they do using AI. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. What really happens is how you can reimagine how work is done. And I think that's the biggest unlock. And there's a lot of observational data about how teams actually build software, how they deploy it, how they organize themselves around it. And then with AI, they can really reimagine how that's done. And the reimagination is, smaller teams, one individual having multiple AI agents, for example, doing that work for them, and very, very task specific. So you can have very task specific agents doing parts of the work, right? And that reimagination is very, very real. Organizations are actually going through that right now, really saying, hey, how does the future organization look like now that AI is absorbing tasks and work? And that's where workforce transformation comes into play. And so how the future organizations look like are those things that many executives are thinking about. And we guide customers along that journey as well, too, right? And so if you think about, for the Jane Goodall Institute, for example, just being able to digitize all this analog data and what that can do for researchers. Now, the cycle time gets reduced, right? And the possibilities of things that they can imagine for how they surface that data to not just researchers, but maybe over time, bigger communities, right? There's a lot that can be reimagined there.
Yeah. I like how you point out that, tech influences culture. Earlier, you also mentioned that culture influences tech, right? So it can go both ways, for sure,
yeah.
for sure. I'm thinking about like with business development, right? It might not be common knowledge that, this customer of mine, we'd reached out in the past, or a colleague of mine had reached out in the past. And for whatever reason, this deal, didn't come to fruition. But now when you're able to put all that context into, an AI tool, you have that, I guess, carried forward that intuition from your past colleagues.
Yeah, and that can help out quite a bit. Obviously for the Jane Goodall Institute, as they observe, chimpanzees, that's observational data. Mm-hmm. In the organization, it's workflow, right? And so what is the workflow? How do people get work done? How do different teams organize themselves around that workflow? And when that gets captured in digital form, you can extract that and then you can modernize it, you can reimagine it, right?
Exactly. So that connection point is a lot more real, I guess, than I had realized. So Anna, with all this, talk of tech and this whole evolution, this transformation that it's really enabled, for the Institute, was there a moment for you where you thought, this really isn't anymore about digitizing archives, but it's kind of starting to feel like preserving the way Jane saw the world?
Wow. Yeah. Well, it is about that because that's her archives give us windows into how she saw the world and into the way in which she shared with the world these interconnected relationships. And that's one of Jane's greatest gifts, I think, to both the scientific community, but to the world at large. She would refer to it as the tapestry of life.
I love that.
I do too. It's a beautiful analogy. And she would talk about that when she was in the forests of Western Tanzania, she started to visualize each bit is a thread on this beautiful interwoven tapestry of life. And by digitizing and being able to access the archives that we have, these handwritten archives, but there's also soundscapes and there's film and there's photography and all these sorts of things. It allows us to get a window into that beautiful tapestry of life that Jane describes.
Such a beautiful image.
Yeah.
And if we can attempt to preserve that and demonstrate that through this tool, that would be...
That's success.
It's
we'll
beautiful.
do it.
That's success. Exactly. So Taimur, with all of this institutional knowledge, suddenly, I like to use the word activated. What would you say changes now in, let's say, how, leaders can get together, make decisions? We, talked about that with Jane and researchers, the scientists that she mentored, but think about this in the boardroom setting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a great question because what context gives these executives is visibility into stuff that they didn't have deep visibility into before, right? And it's at their fingertips. I mean, we've seen this with work that we've done with a number of customers where we're able to technically create what we call a knowledge graph, right? And so it's the digital representation of all those things that reside within an organization. Not only just like, hey, these are the technical systems, but hey, these are the teams that support that. And then the biggest thing right now for executives in the C-suite is how to allocate capital correctly. Because it becomes a question of where do you allocate capital to address not only efficiency, but then growth, new growth. Mm-hmm. And when you have context and you can converse with that context as an executive and look at all the structural things that, maybe need to be corrected, opportunities that are not fully tapped into, you can do better decision-making. And there was a time where just access to that information was very difficult. The data was very fragmented. You wouldn't get that single source of truth. But now with AI-powered modernization, right now in the C-suite, it's really about how do we make quicker decisions now that we have a good understanding of our organization, our people, our systems.
I like that about how the context actually allows capital allocation decisions, right? And so similarly, when you're looking at the patterns of the behavioral data, that also helps, the Institute determine what are our future conservation priorities. I'm sure there's a link there.
100%. And I love talking about this too. I can really relate to this now, putting on my executive hat,
Yes.
my CEO hat, which is coming into an organization, a founder-led organization, now a founder-inspired organization. Those organizations, it's built on a lot of personal relationships. And so to have tools like this that can explain, well, who is this person? I'm sure they were important, and how did they factor in? What thread were they in our tapestry of life? Yes. Is really, really critical of, maintaining that organizational momentum forward and understanding of all those different relationships. So I love that. But yes, it also influences the ways in which we are making investments in our conservation efforts, in our programmatic efforts, because it's showing us, it's unearthing new insights that would have taken much longer for us to discern without it.
Absolutely. So when you think about all that the organization's able to discern now and sort of carrying forward Jane's message, I want to call out a quote that she said, and you can back me up here, hopefully, Anna. What you do makes a difference, and you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make. So if Jane were issuing a challenge right now to the leaders who are listening, or sort of just to other leaders who haven't really yet thought that much about their legacy, what would she say?
Yeah, I love that quote. That's a quote that Jane would often say, because it's an acknowledgement and it's an invitation to the responsibility of it. We have the responsibility to decide what sort of impact, what sort of difference, what choices we make each and every day. So as leaders are looking at their own legacies within the organization, whether it's one of 65 years, as it was with Jane, or maybe it's a shorter programmatic legacy, it's really looking at what is it that they want to pass on? What is it about their time, about their contribution that they want to have endure?
And I would even say that from our business context, for us, it's that responsibility to say, how can we create new value, right? How can we look at value that's been trapped in, decades worth of systems, right? That now we have the power to unlock. And through unlocking that, not only are we going to be more productive, we can be more responsible for how the future organizations look. What does the workforce look like? What does skilling look like? These are all very important questions that executives are asking. All of those things are part of our responsibility to help define and, kind of guide future generations.
So well said. The responsibility to create new value. I appreciate you pointing that out. Well, Anna, Taimur, so great to have you on.
Thank you.
I know I've learned a lot about, institutional memory and the value that it creates, not just for AI, but for all of the future generations of scientists and employees who will be able to take that legacy forward. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you.